You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 536 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. He's a staff writer at RT. He has bylines at antiwar.com, Consortium News, and at the Libertarian Institute, which is where you find this show and the daily news roundup that I write. And, most importantly, Will Porter is the co-host of the coming Conflicts of Interest show, along with myself. And so in a week from now, that show will launch, replacing Foreign Policy Focus. And, me and Will are very excited about the new stuff we have going on, but we have a lot of news to talk about today. Will, how's it going?
Good, man. How you doing, Kyle?
I'm doing pretty well. It's been a week full of news and, trying to avoid the slog of the DNC convention and also, kind of root through. And I think we did a good job of picking out the few stories that really had anything to do with foreign policy out of there. I mean, there's almost no policy to talk about. But other than that, there's a lot of important stuff going on that we have to cover today. This first story, I don't know if it's, necessarily the biggest story in itself, but I think it's certainly something that we have talked about a lot, and that is John Brennan's role in the origins of the Russiagate probe. And so he was interviewed by the John Durham investigation. I'm not sure if Durham himself did the interview or who did, but he's involved in this, interview investigation process by John Durham. And they're basically looking into any possible malfeasance at, the origins of Russiagate. And so they say in this article written up, I think at USA Today, that look, the at least Durham team is putting out that Brennan is a witness and not himself being investigated. Although maybe they're just saying that for him to keep his guard down. But if he's a witness to potential crimes, then, you would think that those crimes would be committed by other, high-level Obama administration officials, Comey, Clapper, Susan Rice, Joe Biden, potentially even the president himself. So it was very interesting. And I guess as of now, we don't know what they talked about. We don't have all the details, but, certainly it has to be around the Steele dossier, how that was involved then in launching investigations into the Trump team, and then the intelligence community assessment that came out in January of 2017 that basically, concludes that Russia interfered in the election, although, now we've seen all the evidence come out and that's clearly not the case. But Will, this is the guy we talked about. We said that he's central to it. And now the Durham team is investigating it and looking and interviewing him for 8 hours. I mean, so there was a lot discussed there. Is there a reason for optimism? So we, finally may actually get to some of the origins of what happened and how we kicked off this whole conspiracy theory that's, overwhelmed the entire country for 4 years, and the media cycle has been nuts.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope so. I hope that this means that, that people like Brennan and Comey and the, intelligence agencies might be held to account for this kind of stuff. Though I wouldn't get my hopes up too much. I mean, I know that the USA Today piece noted that, like, Brennan's not under criminal investigation. None of these people are, really under, like, that kind of, severe scrutiny. Although, I don't know, maybe like you're saying, they just want to keep their guard down. But as far as the indication we have is that, no, they're not under a criminal probe. That, the USA Today piece seemed to kind of make it, I don't know, what, maybe they're just slanting it a little bit or angling it, but they seem to make it like the interview was about, Russia's, attempts to interfere in the election. Like that's what they were talking about, rather than Brennan's involvement in the, launching the investigation into the Trump campaign. And so I'm not sure, 8 hours is a long time. That's a lot of time to discuss, a lot of different subjects. And I do hope that this means that they are going to start, putting people like Brennan under more scrutiny. But I'm not super confident of this. We've talked about how Durham, and we can't really trust these people, him and Barr, to really prosecute this thing. Like, I'm not super confident that they're going to.
Yeah, no, I think that's where we continue to agree. It's just like there's not a lot of reason for optimism that John Durham is going to do anything, but this is a good sign. And, there are real experts in this whole thing, like Ray McGovern, who have insisted for months that, he thinks Durham is going to come up with something. So, again, I think we should try to be optimistic, and certainly, Trump is coming up on his re-election here. And so if things aren't going well, then that's more incentive for him to try to get to the bottom of this. And, I'm really hoping eventually we do see, get some kind of answers. And John Brennan certainly seems to be a man at the center of all of this. Will, I next want to move on and talk to you about, you said you got this story from the Wall Street Journal on a possible change in the U.S. negotiating position on New START that would really be huge and a potential breakthrough.
Yeah. So this is a pretty big development that kind of slipped by me. I didn't notice I didn't notice this until a couple days after it was reported. But you got this piece in the Wall Street Journal saying that the U.S. has now apparently dropped its demand that China be involved in any extension of the New START treaty, which is, as we've talked about in the show, it's a very important arms reduction treaty between the U.S. and Russia. And it kind of limits how many nuclear warheads we can have out in the world at any given time. And that treaty is set to expire in February. But up until last week, U.S. officials were insisting that China would have to be included in negotiations to extend that agreement, which was kind of like a crazy fantasy that it risks kind of imploding and destroying the whole deal because China is not interested in joining this agreement. They've said that many times. Their nuclear arsenal is like 10 times smaller than the U.S.'s or Russia's. So it just would have vastly complicated the whole negotiation process if they were going to try to cram China in there. But now apparently Trump's arms control envoy, Marshall Billingsley, the guy who, talked about an arms race, kicking off an arms race, how we'll spend China into oblivion. This same guy now says that the U.S. is going to look to do a separate arms deal with Beijing, and that they're actually going to now focus on getting New START hammered out with the Russians first. So I think that's a good thing. Ultimately, it was looking like they might allow the New START to just explode and just let it expire over all this China stuff. And now it's seeming like maybe that was more of a bluff, and that they were just trying that as a negotiation tactic, and now they're kind of abandoning that.
Right. One thing that I think more and more people are starting to put out, and it certainly has become true if it wasn't even 6 months ago, and that is there simply isn't time at this point to negotiate a larger deal with Russia and China. We have 6 months to extend a New START. Start with that, and then you could start to build some kind of deal between Russia, China, and the U.S., a trilateral deal, because a New START will then be extended for 5 years. One that I guess recurring problems with the whole bringing China into this theme, well, is just the difference in the nuclear arsenals are. China has 300 weapons, and I'm not even sure how many of them are deployed at any given time, whereas the U.S. and Russia have, 1,500 plus nukes. And so in a lot of ways for China, they say it doesn't make sense for us to join. And, it would be hard to argue that it would mean the same thing for the U.S. to give up 100 nukes, which is a 15th of our arsenal, and for China to do it, which is a third. So there's massive problems there. Now, I have heard of doing percentage reductions, in which case, again, you kind of have the problem. The U.S. is going to destroy 100 nukes as 150, and China is going to do it. It's 30 or less. And so, Mr. Art of the deal, I don't think it is going to be inclined to do something like that. But, at the same time, do we have any idea on the U.S. still seems to want to do some kind of trilateral arms deal that includes China. If they're looking at this in any kind of real, again, we've seen with the Trump administration, it is such a bullish kind of policy where, it's going to be our way. We're going to get this deal done the way we want it. And if not, it's not going to get done.
I mean, I expect we're still going to see sort of the U.S. has this sort of negotiating tactic, especially the Trump administration and his people, that they are more brash and more demanding, it seems. They demand that the other side gives up everything before they even, come to the negotiating table. However, this is a sort of softening of their position. Their position was harder before, demanding that China be included in New START. So, it's a softened position. Although I do expect they'll probably try to, put some pressure on the Chinese to come to this other separate arms control accord. Like I don't expect that the U.S. is going to be real generous in negotiating with China there. But at least we have seen this like slight softening of their position in terms of New START.
Right. So just to get into the weeds a little bit more on this, was this just a statement by the arms negotiator, or do we know if there's a real backing from the administration on it? It seems a lot of times the problem with Trump's administration is that him and the people who actually implement his policy, and we'll talk about this with Iraq shortly, are never on the same page, it seems. And so, for example, weeks before Hanoi, you have now the State Department number 2, Stephen Biegun, saying at a speech that the U.S. was ready to kind of do this sensible kind of deal with North Korea where we reduce some of our sanctions and then they give up parts of their nuclear program. But then weeks later, Trump completely 180s and does something else. So does this signal an actual change in the Trump administration policy, or is this just some one-off statement from some official who, its job it is to get a deal done, understands that this is the way to do it, and so he's out saying this is what we need to do, and in reality that's just not the position of the rest of the Trump administration?
Honestly, I'd have to go back and look at exactly how the Wall Street Journal sourced this. It did seem like Billingsley had like a real, was given permission to go on record and talk about this stuff. I forget exactly how they sourced it though. But again, it did seem like the administration was endorsing this position.
All right. Well, I want to move on now and talk to you about Lebanon, where we had this tribunal release the results, and this is from a 15-year-old assassination of the former prime minister, the Hariri father, not the current politician Saad, but his father, I think Rafiki, right? And so do you want to give us some details on the findings of this report? Because, if you read from different sources, sometimes it sounds like, oh, they nailed Hezbollah to the wall on it. And then if you read the actual thing, it looks like that wasn't quite the conclusion.
Yeah. So the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which is, as you said, like the UN-led like criminal case against the suspects into the assassination of Rafik Hariri, the former prime minister. We finally got verdicts in this now. And, this thing's been going for since 2009. So this is a long time in the making, this whole probe and this criminal case. And they had charged 4 people in this. And they ended up acquitting 3 of them, on everything. They just decided these guys, they didn't have enough evidence to make anything stick to them. However, they did find 1 guy guilty on 5 charges, all related to, terrorism and murder and the assassination of the prime minister. And all these guys had been indicted in 2011, and they were all said to be affiliated with Hezbollah in some way. I'm not sure how much that was ever actually proven. But the one guy, though, that did end up getting charged, they did describe him as some kind of mid-level Hezbollah fighter. And another thing, none of these guys have been found or arrested. So this is all done in absentia. So we should keep in mind this is all kind of a symbolic ruling because people have not been brought into custody.
Yeah, I had heard that the guy who was actually acquitted, nobody has known his whereabouts for at least 5 years. And even before that, it's questionable if people, I guess, actually knew who the guy was and where he is. And as you said, I guess he's best known as like a mid-level Hezbollah fighter, but not like in any way a commander or anything like that.
Right. And so in addition to these, to the rulings that they found, they acquitted these 3 guys and found the 1 guy guilty. The other major finding of the tribunal here was that there was no good evidence to link the Syrian government or the leadership of Hezbollah to the assassination plot, even though they did find that guy, the one they convicted, Salim Jamil Ayash, they found that he was some kind of lower mid-level member, but they still couldn't make anything stick to the actual leadership. And the same thing with the Syrian government. And I think to really understand the significance of that ruling and that finding, I think it would be good to go back and give a little bit of background on sort of what was happening in Lebanon, when Rafik Hariri was assassinated in 2005.
Yeah, please do that, because a completely different world. Israeli occupation of Lebanon is still going on then, right?
Yeah, I believe so. There was still a war there in southern Lebanon. Hariri was killed in 2005 with a car bomb. Killed like 21 other people. It was like a massive thing in Lebanon. It kicked off what we call the Cedar Revolution. It was a massively important geopolitical event there. But Hariri had served prime minister in Lebanon from 1992 to 1998, and then he got elected again in 2000. There's like a little brief interim period where he was out of office. But at that time in Lebanon, Syria was a lot more heavily involved in their politics. Syria had participated in the Lebanese Civil War, which started, I think, 1975, went until 1990. They had actually maintained a troop presence in Lebanon until 2005. And they had all kinds of involvement, like sort of like backing certain favored politicians they liked. There was some meddling going on from the Syrians in Lebanon. So that was sort of, I think Syria does still have some like influence in Lebanon, but in the early 2000s, it was a lot more like open and widespread and brazen. But in 2004, though, there was this huge political crisis over a push to extend the term of the president of Lebanon by 3 years, Emil Lahoud. And the Syrians were backing that proposal, and Hariri kind of came out against it. And so Hariri did vote for that extension, and it was passed, and the president did have his term extended. But he also resigned over it a few weeks later, and it was this huge crisis. It was this big controversial thing. It inflamed a lot of opposition to like Syrian involvement in Lebanon among some of the factions. You had like the Druze were really against him, and some of the Sunnis, including Hariri, whereas like the Shia and Hezbollah and some of the Christians were kind of more aligned with Syrians. So that was sort of the climate in Lebanon before Hariri was assassinated. There's a lot of division over like the Syrian presence there in the country. And Hariri's position in all that led a lot of people to think that, Syria and or Hezbollah were behind his assassination, that they carried it out. However, this tribunal, though, last week, they've now concluded they can't actually prove any of that with evidence. So despite all these widespread suspicions, and they even said that, Syria and Hezbollah had reasons to want Hariri dead in their, the tribunal said this in their summary. But they said they couldn't find anything that they could make stand up in court in that regard, in terms of attaching it to Hezbollah or the Syrian government. And so they really defied a lot of long held suspicions and expectations and stuff in Lebanon. One thing, though, that is kind of weird is that this tribunal was preceded by an investigation by the UN for 4 years. And that investigation put out 10 separate reports where over and over again they kept saying they had all this evidence that Hezbollah and the Syrian government were involved in the assassination. I know there was some controversy behind some of those previous reports. Some of the witnesses were called into question, that they were claimed to be false witnesses. So I guess maybe the tribunal decided that old stuff was not usable. But regardless, though, the ruling we just got is way different from what the UN had been saying for quite a long time before this. That they had been sort of pointing toward Hezbollah and Syria being involved. And so now they've sort of, they've put out this ruling that's quite different from that.
Right. So, one thing that I've been kind of looking at what people like Elijah Madnay and Asani22 are saying on Twitter, and Joanne Leone, our friend over at the Around the Empire podcast, has actually interviewed both of those people recently. And, one of the things that I think most people who are, serious about foreign policy kind of know about Lebanon is that the country kind of sits in a very, very difficult position where I think there hasn't been a census in the country in 80 years or something. And people are terrified of having a census because so much of the parliament is based on the percentage of the citizens. And so if you do a census, then it's going to drastically change the number of, I'm pretty sure Christians would lose a lot of seats, whereas Shia and Sunni would get more. There's also the fact that I think a fifth or so of the people living in Lebanon are refugees. And, most of those are Sunni Muslims. And, who knows how many of the Syrians will go home. And it doesn't seem like, the Palestinians may never have a home again in Palestine to return to. And so I was just wondering, how does this ruling factor into that? And I guess just from some of the commentary I read, it seemed like the outcome was the one that would provoke the least tensions to arise. It was very we got this one guy who did it, but the larger conspiracy wasn't there. So they get somebody, but they don't get the people that a lot of people think, Hezbollah and the Syrian government. And so, that would probably be the ruling that created more tension. I was just wondering if you thought that it impacted any way, or if this ruling could impact Lebanon in that way.
Yeah, I got the same impression that they were trying to maybe not rock the boat too much with this ruling. Like it didn't, they made it, I don't know, the geopolitical effects won't be quite as severe as if they were to, say the Syrian government did it. I know that there's a lot of feeling in Lebanon right now. I was reading a lot of reports of just like man on the street interviews, and people are kind of upset about it. They're kind of like, nah, like they don't think this really uncovered the truth. Like this one guy is now the fall guy, and they didn't, uncover any of the wider conspiracy, as you were saying. But yeah, I do think that this is maybe designed, I don't know how deliberately, but at least the effect of this definitely will be less than, the alternative of what the UN had previously been saying. Had they pursued all that other so-called evidence, I'm not totally sure the veracity of that. That was called into question. But, had they pursued that, I think that would have been a much more explosive thing for the region, for international politics.
Right. Yeah. I've read that a lot of the evidence that was actually brought up in the tribunal was cell phone data. And It's like was so circumstantial that it wasn't, they couldn't come to a conclusion on it. And so, my guess is that's, the problem a lot of times if something is orchestrated at this high of a level. My assumption is that Hezbollah wasn't acting like Richard Nixon, recording everything that was happening. And so you're not going to go back and find that. And then the lack of any clarity around it, I'm guessing, is going to make a lot of people just, kind of accept their own conclusions, no matter what the tribunal came to, as you were saying. People feeling like, they didn't get the guys who were actually responsible for it and stuff like that. So I guess, one of the like breathing a sigh of relief, with having the literal massive explosion in Beirut just days before this ruling was supposed to come out and then does come out. I guess it's a good thing maybe you didn't have a second massive explosion with this ruling. But, we've talked about on the show that there's ongoing protests going on in Lebanon. At least from what I've observed through the news, it doesn't seem like there's been a particular increase in the protests following this ruling. I've seen, reports of people complaining about it and people on the street complaining about it. But protests were going on before, and it doesn't seem like there's maybe been a larger escalation. But do we have any idea if this will tie into the people's demand that to have a new parliamentary election? At least, replace the prime minister and the cabinet, maybe not the president and the speaker of the house, but how's this factor into that?
I haven't actually seen like people making that direct connection between like, the recent political crisis with the explosion and all the corruption and stuff and this ruling, though I'm sure it will kind of feed into just the general anger at the government right now. Right. That sort of feeling of not being satisfied with the investigation. I'm sure that'll just, kind of inflame their feelings that the government's not too trustworthy. One thing I did see, though, that was kind of interesting is that Saad Hariri, the son of Rafik, the guy who was assassinated, he did come out and said that like he accepts the ruling and stuff. And so that I think might help a little bit to calm things, to keep things calm, where the son of the guy who was assassinated is saying that like, I accept this ruling and I'm not going to still be calling for revenge or, justice or whatever.
I think it was his other brother or other son, one of Saad's brothers, who was not quite so favorable towards the ruling. And I don't know, I don't want to say came out against it, but was far more skeptical of it. And so, there's definitely are some leaders in the Sunni side of the Lebanon community that's, are expressing skepticism. But, I suppose we should move on and talk about Iraq now, where we've gotten some interesting stories in the past couple of weeks. The first one is the U.S. Coalition calls on Iraq to dismantle its armed groups. And, this is about the Shia militias that rose as the absence of the Iraqi army. The U.S. dismantles it in 2006 and never puts together an Iraqi army under the new government that could, really hold Iraqi territory. That's why when ISIS pops up as a result of the U.S. policy in Syria and blows back into Iraq in 2013 and 2014, they take so much territory so easily. And it's not, until these Shia militias really get involved on the ground that things start to turn around. And so these are people in Iraq that have a lot of status among the people and are, a lot of people see them, especially in the Shia community, as being very important. However, they are heavily influenced by Iraq, and it was the now assassinated Qasem Soleimani who worked with the also assassinated number 2 of Kataib Hezbollah. I forget his first name. I think his last name is Mohandes. And they were assassinated together in that early strike in 2020, drone strike by the U.S. government. And so, with those two gone, I'm sure there's still a lot of hatred and sentiment towards the United States. And so the U.S. continues to demand that the Iraqi government gets rid of these groups, although at least as far as I can see, I don't know if the Iraqi government really has the ability to. There's enough discontent within not only the Sunni and Kurdish, people of Iraq who don't really control the government, but the Shia as well, that if they go after these groups, I'm not sure, how happy the people are going to be with it. And, if they're going to, complete Hezbollah has their support and they'll be able to rally that up. And I'm not sure with as fragile as the Iraqi state is right now, this is a good move. But then on the other hand, so the U.S. is making this demand, and then at the same time, they're also talking about pulling out U.S. troops, and Trump saying that he wants to get that done by the election. And I don't know. So for me, these are kind of opposites, where trying to, get the Iraqi government to dismantle the Shia militia seems foolish. It's not going to work probably. And it's going to just create blowback against the Iraqi government. But at the same time, if we could get U.S. troops out of there, then, maybe that is helpful. Although maybe the people of Iraq feel like without the U.S. forces there, you're going to need the Shia militias even more to deal with, whatever remaining Sunni extremists exist in Iraq. So, Will, I'll let you go ahead and weigh in on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with the Popular Mobilization Forces, or as they call the Hashd al-Shabi, the Shia militias there in Iraq, it just underscores this ongoing, massive irony. Because the United States, when we invaded Iraq, that's exactly who we sided with. We sided with the Iran-backed Shia parties and Shia militias. The Dawa Party, the Badr Brigade, the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, all these Shia-backed parties. And at some point, we did this thing we called Seymour Hersh called the redirection, where we decided, we backed all these Shia parties. And now we're still, dealing with the consequences of that, of turning on them and deciding that actually we don't so much like the Shia-backed groups in Iraq. And so now we're still seeing the U.S. trying to clean up its mess that, after backing and empowering these groups, now we're deciding that, they're intolerable. We can't stand the Shia militias there. So that's just an irony we should point out, I think, of the U.S. position here in Iraq, constantly shifting and changing. And then in terms of the withdrawal, Trump's sort of pains to want to withdraw, his lip service to withdrawing. I do agree there is sort of a tension between the two things, between, continuing to demand that Iraq has to, bow to our dictate and dismantle its militias and stuff. Whether or not it's actually able to, as you said, that's not totally clear. There is sort of a tension between that demand and then saying that, we have to get out of there. We've been there too long, as Trump was saying just recently when he met with the prime minister. And so it is kind of just I don't know, they keep making new commitments and new priorities and new jobs for the U.S. to oversee in Iraq. And then Trump, as Trump, meanwhile, says how badly he wants to leave. It's I kind of question that commitment to wanting to leave if he's going to let Pompeo run roughshod and just, drive U.S. policy there in Iraq and make – because when Trump was asked, he was asked about a potential withdrawal in Iraq. And Trump kicked the question over to Pompeo during this press conference. And Pompeo said something like, only when our mission is complete. And so that's just a promise to stay there forever and ever. And Trump seems to be fine with that, despite, over and over again saying that he wants to leave.
Right. So I guess, this is one of those cases, Will, where I don't think there's a real reason to be optimistic that Trump is serious about getting U.S. troops out of Iraq. But at the same time, we are coming up to this election. Joe Biden was a huge advocate for the Iraq war. He's part of the reason that we ended up in that mess and helped lie us into it. And so if Trump sees that and, wants to run against Biden on this issue, I guess I do have hope right now, with the Russiagate investigation that maybe we'll get lucky and he'll, pull out of Afghanistan, pull out of Iraq. I guess one of the problems I see with pulling out of Iraq is I think the supply lines to Syria are critical going through Iraq. And so if the U.S. is signing oil deals, and I'm guessing that this Delta Consulting Group felt somewhat confidence that, that the U.S. wasn't going to leave next week and turn this over to the Syrian government, who won't give them the contract again. And so, I guess, it's an obvious case of Trump really not understanding foreign policy and what he's dealing with here. But the guy needs some big wins. And this would be a huge win that he could have right now. But my guess is that he ends up more on the side of Pompeo saying we need to accomplish all of our goals. Pompeo recently was the one that came out and said the dismantling of the Shia militias are one of those goals. And so, unfortunately, I don't think we're out of Iraq by the election, and probably not, second term of the Trump administration or first of the Biden either.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to agree that does not seem to be in the cards anytime soon. Afghanistan, maybe. I'm a little more optimistic there, but Iraq, not so much.
So let's talk about the situation going on in Mali, Will, where there was a coup d'etat. I guess most people probably can't find Mali on the map and don't know very much about it at all. I've talked about it on the show, on and off, and I've never done like a whole detailed coverage of it or anything, but just talk about the ongoing civil war there and how it was largely at the very night started but exacerbated by the U.S. war in Libya, the fleeing jihadists, and then I try to cover the ethnic violence mainly that's going on there. And my understanding was a lot of this kicked off by either the Tuaregs or the jihadists from Libya bleeding over into Mali, and then taking advantage of this ethnic strife to kind of get their own soldiers in and commit acts of violence and atrocities. And the military has really taken a beating here, including like mass attacks on a couple of their bases and scores of their soldiers being killed. And so then it appears this is a military coup. Give us the details we know. And I know that there's not like a completely coherent story coming out yet.
Right. That's true. But you are right that there was a military coup. On Tuesday, we started seeing we had these reports kind of trickling out that a group of soldiers had arrested the president, Ibrahim Keita, and the prime minister, Babu Sise, and a bunch of other, the finance minister, a bunch of top officials. And yeah, it did turn out to be true. Like, we first started seeing some things on Twitter. We eventually started getting videos of the soldiers moving through the capital city. And yeah, there was indeed a coup. And it started at their military base, actually, where this group of soldiers, they mutinied and they arrested some senior commanders who wouldn't join them, I guess. And they grabbed up a bunch of weapons and they stormed the capital city of Bamako. And they, went and took over a bunch of government buildings. They went to the president's house and detained him. And I think there were other officials there, too. And it doesn't seem like they really met much resistance in any of this. I haven't really seen many reports of bloodshed or shootouts or anything. I think they kind of just rolled in there, and maybe they had enough guys that like people wouldn't dare, stand up against them. So far, it doesn't seem like this has really escalated into any kind of real shooting conflict. But the soldiers, though, have been demanding better pay for like a long time now. It's been an ongoing issue for them. Like you said, too, they've kind of been cannon fodder in this conflict against jihadist militants up in the north there. People have not been too happy about how that the government's been like prosecuting that insurgency, fighting that insurgency. And there's also been protests for a long time, too, just more broadly in Mali, of people demanding the president step down, for all the typical reasons of corruption and mismanagement. And like I said, mishandling that conflict against the insurgents there. And so this is basically a mutiny that turned into a coup, that like broadened into a coup d'etat. And people have come out in the streets in pretty big numbers to like support the coup and the soldiers. You can see videos online of people sort of celebrating and cheering the mutiny and coup. So they seem to be pretty supportive of this. There seems to be some popular, feeling behind the mutineers. The president, though, has been forced to resign. Like, he came out, I think, and said he's no longer in office. And the coup leaders are now saying that they're going to hold an election sometime. Like, they didn't really spell out when or exactly how this will happen, but they did say within some reasonable amount of time they want to try to transition back to a civilian government. And as you would expect, a lot of like regional actors, a lot of foreign countries have been very condemned this coup and sort of demanded that they end their junta and hand over control to this civilian leadership. But so far the soldiers don't seem willing to step down immediately. At least they did say they'd organize an election or something, but they're not, I don't think, handing over power right away. I know they've been in mediation. There's like this bloc, it's an economic bloc of West African states that they've been negotiating with, and apparently those talks are going well. They're not a total disaster yet, but I know this bloc is trying to put pressure on the military junta to give up power. I think they even cut off like diplomatic ties. They cut off financial ties. They blocked the border into Mali, some of these countries, and so they are trying to pressure this junta to sort of give up. But so far, it doesn't seem like they're really, willing to do that.
Yeah. So from what I've seen, that there's been pretty much international condemnation of the coup, including from this G5 group, which are a set of states from the Sahel region of West Africa. There, I think it includes Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, Niger. I'm not sure what the other countries in that group are. And they are waging like a little campaign against AQIM, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb, Boko Haram, ISIS, and whatever other, group that pops up that, is Sunni jihadist, Islamic, base. They're waging campaigns against all those groups, which, it seems to only be exacerbating those problems. Anybody who tries to keep up with the violence in West Africa knows that it's a weekly, probably 2 or 3 times a week, there's 10 or so people killed in violence. Just they say gunmen on motorbikes show up in a village, kill a bunch of people, maybe steal some food, some cows or something like that, and drive off. And so that happens, and then once a week it's more. It's a score of people. It's 50 people sometimes it's 70 or 80. At one point, it was even some Canadians that were like, a part of a mining company or something that were attacked, I believe, in Burkina Faso. And so there's this G5 group that's condemned it. I think largely it's the former colonial power France that has been trying to organize to push this at the UN and also carry out their own intervention in this region against the jihadist groups in France themselves that have, I believe, lost several troops in Mali. And so this is like kind of a part of the same larger fight that the U.S. lost some troops in Niger. I don't know how related all the different Islamic sections and jihadist cells are in this region, but they're all being fought against by the U.S., France, and this G5 group. And so I saw that the U.S. had cut off their military ties with Mali for now. France has condemned this. Is there, I guess, any indication on what this coup government is intending to do with the fact that there's international forces in their country fighting jihadists? Are they kicking the occupiers out? Are they letting them stay? Are they maybe just punting on the issue and saying whoever gets elected gets to decide? Do we have any idea on that? Because I guess that's how this is probably going to, play out most on the international stage is, the fight against the terrorists in that country.
No, I haven't actually heard anything about the coup leaders saying anything about kicking out international forces or how they were going to try to, handle the, because they're still saying that we're going to hand over the government to civilian control at some point. So I guess maybe they're not saying that like, hey, we're going to stay in charge and this is our plan or anything. But perhaps if they happen to stay in charge, I think we have some indication of how this coup leader will sort of interact with the U.S. At least if this report on Friday in the Washington Post is anything to go by. Because this is something else I was going to mention in terms of like the foreign meddling. We have this report that the U.S. military had trained the leader of this coup. His name's Assimi Goïta. That he
every time.
Exactly, because Mali had another coup, a military coup in 2012, and it was a different American trained army captain who was behind that one. And so this case, we seem to have some indication that again, it's the Washington Post. They're going off of some anonymous military sources, both in Mali and the U.S. But so grains of salt. But it's not implausible at all that this guy would have worked with counterterrorism forces training fighters in Mali. the U.S. has the similar kind of operations all over the continent that we're training up these counterterrorism forces, so-called, through AFRICOM. And so, and apparently it's not only the U.S. too. Apparently this same guy, this military leader, this coup leader, had similar relationships with the French and the German militaries as well. And so this guy apparently was somewhat friendly with like the foreign military forces. And if the Daily Beast, if you believe what they were reporting, they were also trained by the Russians too. And so, that I don't know quite. I haven't looked super deeply into their report yet, but that's what they say, that some of these coup plotters had been trained in Russia. It's kind of funny. I saw on the same exact day, back to back, these two headlines, like Mali coup leader trained by U.S. military, and then Mali coup leaders trained by Russia. It's like, I don't know. Definitely the U.S. one is plausible in terms of what I know about AFRICOM. I haven't seen, I haven't looked super deeply into the claims about Russia, though I wouldn't be too surprised given that it seems this guy had, relationships with Germany, France, like you said, the former colonial power, and other, foreign meddlers, basically. And it is interesting, like I mentioned, like this coup does very much resemble the 2012 coup, which also started at the same military base, actually, by the Capitol. And ended up grabbing weapons and overthrowing the government. And it was a U.S. trained military commander who did that. So there are some interesting parallels, I guess.
Yeah. It sounds like the fact that they allege that both the U.S. and the Russians had trained this guy, I guess, just goes to show how much international involvement there is. Just in North Africa. So we'll definitely keep an eye on this one. If there's, more information coming out of Mali, I'm sure we'll talk about it on the show. Will, before we, wrap up all here, tell us where to find your work and what we should be looking at.
Yeah, sure. If you guys want to read what I write, the best place to do that is probably to go to my Twitter handle, and I am at the Will Porter there. So that's where you can find all my stuff at RT, and I have author archives at the Libertarian Institute, a place called the Daily Sheeple, antiwar.com, and Consortium News.
All right, and then make sure you all are subscribing to the stuff for the new show, the YouTube page. If we could have 100 subscribers by the time we launch it next week, that would be great. We're on our way there, so if you could, go to the show notes page at the Libertarian Institute. The links for the Twitter. Follow it, the Facebook page, like it, and the YouTube, subscribe to it, will all be in the show notes page. And, we look forward to starting the new show next week. So, Will, thanks so much, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Kyle. Take care, man.